A lot of people think property disputes start with lawyers, courtrooms, and stacks of paperwork. Mine started with a cup of coffee and a fence that wasn't supposed to be there. The morning I realized my new neighbors had built their fence 8 feet onto my property, I stood in my backyard staring at it for a long minute, honestly wondering if I was losing my mind. Maybe I remembered the boundary wrong. Maybe 11 years had blurred the details. But deep down I already knew something wasn't right. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside a small town in Missouri, the kind of place where people wave from pickup trucks even if they don't know your name. I bought my house back in 2012. Nothing fancy, just a white 2-story place with a wooden front porch, a detached garage, and a backyard that stretched farther than most of the lots around me. One of the reasons I bought it was because it felt open. The previous owner never believed in fences. There was grass, a few old oak trees, and enough room to breathe. For over a decade, nobody argued about property lines. Nobody measured anything. Nobody cared. Then old Mrs. Donnelly sold the house behind mine, and everything changed. The new owners were a young couple named Trevor and Madison. They weren't bad people, at least not at first. They were ambitious, energetic, always talking about upgrades and investments. Within days of moving in, they had contractors everywhere. New roof, new windows, fresh landscaping. It seemed like every morning another truck was parked in their driveway. Honestly, I figured they were just excited about their new place. I even introduced myself the first weekend they moved in. We talked over the fence line that didn't exist yet. Trevor shook my hand and said they planned on being there for years. I told him welcome to the neighborhood. If I had known how things were going to turn out, that conversation would have felt a lot different. About 2 weeks later, I came home from work and saw a fencing company unloading cedar panels. By sunset, half the fence was already standing. The next day, they finished the rest. It was one of those tall privacy fences, solid wood, 6 feet high, built to keep the world out. I remember standing on my deck looking at it. Something felt off immediately. I couldn't explain it. The fence seemed closer than it should have been. Not dramatically closer, just enough to make me pause. That night, I tried convincing myself I was imagining things. Maybe the new fence changed the perspective. Maybe open space had fooled my eyes all those years. But the feeling stayed with me. The next morning, I grabbed a measuring tape from my garage. I walked to an old oak tree near the back corner of my lot. That tree had been there longer than any house on the street. I remembered roughly how far it sat from the boundary. I stretched the tape measure and checked the distance twice. Then a third time. My stomach dropped. The number wasn't even close. I went back inside, pulled out an old property sketch from my closing documents, and checked it again. According to every measurement I had, nearly 8 feet of my yard now sat on the other side of Trevor's brand new fence. 8 feet might not sound like much to some people, but when it's running across the width of your property, it adds up fast. More importantly, it wasn't his. It was mine. Still, I wasn't looking for a fight. In fact, I assumed there had been some kind of mistake. Contractors make errors. Survey stakes get misplaced. These things happen. So later that afternoon, I walked over and knocked on their door. Trevor answered with a smile. I explained what I found and pointed toward the fence. I think there might be an issue with the property line, I said. His smile faded a little. The contractor followed the survey markers, he replied. I asked if I could see the survey. He said he didn't have it. I asked if they'd be willing to double-check before everything became permanent. He folded his arms and glanced past me toward the backyard. Honestly, the fence is already finished. We paid a lot for it. I'm sure it's fine. There was something about the way he said it that bothered me. Not angry, not defensive, just dismissive. Like the conversation itself was an inconvenience. I tried one more time. If it's on my property, we should probably figure that out now. He shrugged. The contractor knows what he's doing. Then he wished me a good evening and closed the door. I stood there for a moment staring at the house. That was the exact moment this stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like a choice. Because if someone truly believes they're right, they usually want proof. Trevor didn't seem interested in proof. He seemed interested in keeping the fence exactly where it was. So that night, I sat at my kitchen table, looked out toward the backyard through the window above the sink, and made a decision. If he trusted his survey so much, I'd get my own. And once I knew the truth for certain, one way or another, this issue was going to be settled. 3 days later, a survey truck rolled into my driveway, just after sunrise. The surveyor's name was Hank Morrison, a guy who looked like he'd spent most of his life outdoors. He wore a faded baseball cap, carried equipment that probably cost more than my pickup truck, and spoke with the kind of confidence that only comes from doing the same job for 30 years. I walked the property with him, showed him my original paperwork, and then left him alone to do what he did best. For most of the morning, I watched from my deck while he moved back and forth across both lots, taking measurements, checking records, and marking points. Around noon, he waved me over. I remember the exact look on his face. Not surprised, not confused, certain. He pointed toward Trevor's fence and said, "You're right. Not only is it over the line, it's over by quite a bit." Then he started planting bright orange flags along the actual property boundary. One after another, they formed a straight line, and every single flag sat well inside Trevor's new fence. Seeing those markers was strangely satisfying. For a week, I'd wondered whether I was mistaken. Now there was no question. 8 feet of my property had been enclosed inside someone else's backyard. Hank handed me the official survey documents before he left. I took photos of everything, scanned the paperwork, and emailed copies to Trevor that same afternoon. I wasn't trying to embarrass him. I wasn't threatening legal action. The message was simple. The survey confirms the fence is on my property. Let's figure out how to correct it. Then I waited. 1 day passed. No response. 3 days passed. Nothing. A week passed. Silence. Eventually, I walked over and knocked on the door again. This time, Trevor answered, looking annoyed before I even opened my mouth. "Did you get the survey?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "I got it. So what do you want to do?" He sighed dramatically. "Look, moving that fence would cost thousands of dollars." I stared at him. "That's not really my problem." He rubbed the back of his neck and then delivered the sentence that changed everything. "You've still got plenty of yard." For a second, I honestly thought I misheard him. "Are you serious?" I asked. He shrugged. "It's 8 feet. You probably won't even notice it's gone." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. "So your solution is for me to give you part of my property because fixing your mistake costs money?" Another shrug. Fences end up a little off sometimes. Then he stepped back inside and closed the door. Just like that. No negotiation. No apology. No attempt to compromise. Walking back across my lawn, I wasn't angry the way people imagine. I wasn't plotting revenge. Mostly I was disappointed. There had been so many opportunities to solve the problem. One conversation. One contractor visit. One reasonable decision. Instead, Trevor kept choosing the most arrogant option available. That evening, I started digging through county records. Not because I planned to sue him. Lawsuits take forever. Lawyers get rich. Everybody else gets headaches. I wanted to know exactly what rights I had. A few hours later, I found something interesting. The strip of land behind Trevor's fence still legally belonged to me. The fence didn't change ownership. It didn't create a new boundary. It was simply sitting in the wrong place, which meant that every inch of ground trapped inside his backyard remained my property. I sat there staring at the screen and slowly started smiling. A strange idea had begun taking shape. Over the next several days, I made a few phone calls, then a few more. I checked local regulations, verified setback requirements, confirmed permits. The more research I did, the more I realized I could solve this entire situation without ever stepping inside a courtroom. 2 weeks later, a landscaping contractor pulled into my driveway with a trailer carrying a compact excavator. Around lunchtime, another truck arrived loaded with steel posts and construction materials. I noticed Trevor standing on his deck almost immediately. Even from a distance, I could tell he was confused. A few minutes later, he walked over. "What's all this?" he asked. I smiled politely. "Just doing some work on my property." He looked past me toward the equipment. "What kind of work?" "You'll see." The crew began measuring along the survey line. Then they started digging. Hole after hole appeared directly inside the area enclosed by Trevor's fence. Watching realization slowly spread across his face was almost impressive. "Wait a second," he said. "You can't build anything in there." I pointed toward the survey markers. "Actually, I can. That's my property." His eyes moved from the orange flags to the excavation holes and back again. For the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't have a comeback. He just stood there quietly. The work continued for 2 full days. By Friday afternoon, 12 heavy-duty steel posts stood anchored in concrete along the entire disputed strip. They weren't decorative. They weren't temporary. They were built to stay exactly where they were. Trevor watched the process from his deck several times. Madison watched too. Once I overheard them arguing. Not shouting, just tense conversations carried by the wind. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. She wanted the fence moved. He didn't want to spend the money. At one point, I actually felt a little bad for her. It seemed obvious she understood the situation much better than he did. The following week, the second phase began. Large wooden planter boxes arrived. Each one was sturdy, attractive, and completely legal. The crew installed them between the steel posts, creating a long, continuous structure running across the disputed section of land. Trevor came over again while the workers were filling them with soil. "What exactly are those for?" he asked. "Plants," I replied. "What kind of plants?" "Fast-growing ones." He narrowed his eyes. "You're doing this on purpose." I smiled. "I'm landscaping my property." Technically, it was the truth. Over the next few days, dozens of young bamboo plants went into those planters. Not invasive bamboo. The legal contained variety approved for residential landscaping. I made absolutely sure of that. Trevor looked skeptical at first. To him, they probably seemed harmless. Little green shoots sticking out of boxes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing threatening. But bamboo grows quickly, much faster than most people realize. Spring turned into summer. Every few weeks, the plants gained more height. 3 feet became 5. 5 became 7. Then one afternoon, I walked outside and realized they were towering over the fence. Thick green stalks, dense leaves, an almost solid wall of vegetation. The transformation was remarkable. From my side, they looked beautiful. From Trevor's side, they were a disaster. His expensive new deck no longer overlooked an open backyard. It faced a giant living curtain. The afternoon sunlight disappeared. Areas that once received full sun spent most of the day in shade. Decorative flower beds started struggling. Patio furniture sat beneath shadows. Even the view from several rear windows changed completely. One Saturday morning, I was grilling burgers when I noticed Trevor standing on his deck, staring at the bamboo. He looked like a man watching a slow-motion train wreck. For months, he'd treated the missing 8 feet like it was insignificant. Now, every time he looked outside, those 8 feet dominated the entire landscape. And the truly ironic part was that I wasn't doing anything illegal. I wasn't harassing him. I wasn't damaging his property. I was simply using my own land. Exactly the argument he'd made when he refused to move the fence. The difference was that my version came with consequences he could see from every window in the house. By late summer, the bamboo had become the most talked-about feature on the block. Neighbors walking dogs would slow down and stare. People mowing lawns would glance over. Nobody needed the full story to understand something unusual was happening. The tension between our properties had become impossible to ignore. Then one evening, just as the sun was setting behind the trees, I saw Trevor walking across his yard toward my house again. Only this time something was different. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. For the first time since this whole mess started, he looked like a man who finally understood he had made a very expensive mistake. I was sitting on my back porch that evening with a glass of iced tea when Trevor stopped a few feet away from the steps. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The bamboo rustled softly in the breeze behind him, almost like it knew it was the reason he was standing there. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Can we talk?" I nodded toward an empty chair. He sat down, leaned forward, and rubbed his hands together. He looked exhausted. Not angry anymore. Just tired. "The bamboo is becoming a problem," he said. I took a sip of my drink. "Really?" He let out a breath. "Come on, man. You know what I mean." I didn't know what he meant. His backyard had become a completely different place than the one he and Madison had spent thousands of dollars creating. The deck stayed shaded most of the day. The landscaping wasn't thriving. The open feeling they wanted was gone. Every time they looked outside, they saw a reminder of a decision that should have been fixed months earlier. "What would you like me to do about it?" I asked. He stared at the yard for a second before answering. "Would you consider removing it?" There it was. The conversation we could have had from the very beginning. The conversation that would have saved everyone time, money, and frustration. I nodded slowly. "Maybe." His face brightened slightly. "Really?" "Sure," I said. "As soon as the fence is moved back onto your property." The optimism disappeared almost instantly. He looked down at the ground, then over at the bamboo, then finally back at me. Deep down, I think he already knew that was the answer. He was just hoping for a cheaper one. We sat there quietly for a few moments before he finally stood up. "I'll talk to a contractor." "That's probably a good idea," I replied. 2 weeks later, a fencing company arrived early on a Monday morning. I watched from my kitchen window as workers began removing panel after panel. The same fence that had caused all the trouble came apart surprisingly fast. By lunchtime, several sections were already gone. The next day, they pulled the posts. Fresh holes appeared across the yard where the old fence had stood. Then they rebuilt everything along the actual property line, exactly where the survey markers had been sitting all along. No arguments, no lawyers, no dramatic courtroom scenes. Just a very expensive correction to a very preventable mistake. Once the work was finished, I kept my word. The landscaping crew returned the following week. The planter boxes came out. The bamboo was removed. Within a few days, the giant green wall that had dominated the backyard all summer was gone. Sunlight reached Trevor's deck again. His flower beds recovered. The open view returned. And perhaps most importantly, my missing 8 feet of property came back exactly where it belonged. The funny thing is that after everything was resolved, life slowly returned to normal. Trevor and I never became friends, but we eventually reached something close to mutual respect. Sometimes we'd wave when passing each other. Occasionally we'd exchange a few words about the weather or neighborhood news. The hostility faded. Maybe because there was nothing left to fight about. Maybe because both of us learned something from the experience. Looking back now, years later, people often ask if the whole bamboo project was revenge. Honestly, I don't think it was. Revenge would have been tearing down the fence myself the second I got the survey results. Revenge would have been dragging him into court and trying to bury him in legal fees. What I did was simpler. I used my property in a way that forced him to confront a reality he had spent months ignoring. The fence never bothered Trevor because he wasn't the one losing anything. The bamboo changed that. Suddenly, the consequences were impossible to overlook. And once those consequences became personal, the solution appeared almost immediately. Funny how that works. The biggest lesson wasn't about property lines or surveys. It was about respect. Most neighborhood disputes aren't really about land, fences, trees, or driveways. They're about whether people believe the rules apply equally to everyone. Trevor assumed 8 feet wasn't a big deal because it belonged to someone else. If the situation had been reversed, I doubt he would have felt the same way. That's the part people often miss. Ownership isn't measured by how much space you have left. It's measured by whether your rights are respected in the first place. Every now and then I'll stand near those old oak trees at the back of my yard and look toward the fence sitting exactly where it should have been from day one. The grass has grown back. The survey flags are long gone. Most people driving past would never know there was ever a dispute. But I remember. And honestly, part of me still wonders what would have happened if Trevor had simply said, "Let's fix it," during that very first conversation at his front door. We could have avoided months of tension, thousands of dollars in expenses, and one very famous wall of bamboo. Then again, maybe some lessons only stick when they become impossible to ignore. So now I want to hear from you. If your neighbor built a fence 8 feet onto your property and refused to move it after seeing proof, what would you have done? Was the bamboo wall a fair solution, or did I take things too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always split people right down the middle. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates a little old-fashioned property line justice.